$22 and a sack of dried corn was what Opal Finch's father decided she was worth. She didn't cry when he told her. She'd already used up most of her tears the winter her mother died, and the ones she had left she wasn't going to waste on a man who smelled like rotgut whiskey and broken promises. She just stood there in the doorway of the cabin they'd shared for 20 years, watching him count the coins into a stranger's palm like he was selling off a lame mule, and she thought, at least the mule never had to watch it happen. The man who paid for her was named Rook. Nobody in Caldera Junction knew his first name, or if they did, they weren't saying. He wasn't the kind of man people asked questions of. He came down from the high country maybe twice a year, bought what he needed: salt, flour, a new blade when the old one went dull, and then he went back up and disappeared into the pine ridges above the snowline like smoke. He was large in the way that old-growth timber is large, not threatening, exactly, just a thing that had been there long enough that the world had shaped itself around him rather than the other way around. He hadn't come to Caldera Junction to buy a woman. He'd come for a new axe handle and a quarter-pound of coffee. But the man holding Opal's arm in front of the trading post had a debt he needed settling, and Rook happened to be standing near enough to hear what was being offered. She works, her father said. He had the decency, at least, to not look at her when he said it. Knows how to cook, salt meat, mend, good hands. The man her father owed. A thin fellow with a silver tooth, and the kind of eyes that stay flat even when he's smiling, looked Opal over the way you'd look at a horse for soundness. She looked back at him and thought about the knife in her left boot and how long she'd go to prison if she used it. Rook said nothing for a long moment. He shifted his weight, which was considerable, and looked at the thin man. "How much to settle it?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. The thin man named his number. Rook reached into his coat. He didn't look at Opal once during the transaction. She found that more unnerving than if he had. She rode behind him on his horse, because that was the only horse there was. She sat as far back on the animal's rump as she could manage without sliding off, and held on to the back of the saddle instead of him. The cold came down off the mountain in long grey sheets. Her coat wasn't thick enough for this elevation, and she knew it, and there was nothing to do about it. She had 37 cents in her left boot next to the knife. She'd been hiding money for 2 years, small amounts, a coin here and there from what she made, taking in laundry. 37 cents wasn't enough to get far, but it was something. It was hers. Rook didn't speak for the first 2 hours of the ride. The trail narrowed and steepened, and the trees got bigger and darker, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. She started shivering and couldn't stop. He pulled the horse up without warning, reached back into one of the saddlebags, handed her a wool blanket without turning around. She took it, wrapped it around her shoulders. Didn't say thank you, because she wasn't sure yet whether he'd earned it. They rode the rest of the way in silence. His cabin was built into the side of a ridge like it had grown there. She'd expected something crude. A trapper's lean-to maybe, a dirt floor and a smoke-blackened wall. What she found was tight-fitted log work, a good stone chimney, shelves along one wall, holding canned goods and tools arranged with a kind of quiet order that surprised her. A single window facing east, a loft up a fixed ladder with a straw mattress, one chair, one table, one bed in the corner that was larger than the chair, and table put together, and had real quilts on it. He started a fire without being asked. She stood in the middle of the room and watched him. "Loft," he said, tilting his head toward the ladder. "That's where you sleep. There's extra blankets in the trunk." She looked at the loft, then at him. "And if I decide to leave in the morning?" He had his back to her, feeding split wood into the firebox. He didn't turn around. "Then you leave in the morning." She waited for the rest of it, the part where he told her what she owed him, the part where he explained the terms of the arrangement, what it would cost her to eat his food and sleep under his roof. She'd met men like him before. She thought she had. They always got to the terms eventually. He never did. He fed her salt pork and cornbread and black coffee, and then he sat in his chair by the fire with a piece of wood he was working into something, a slow and careful occupation that required his whole attention, and he left her to either sleep or stare at the ceiling, whichever she needed. She climbed up to the loft. She lay there for a long time, listening to the wind work itself against the eaves and the low creak of his chair, and the occasional chunk of wood meeting the blade of his knife. She did not sleep, but she did not leave either. The morning came blue and cold and absolute. Opal came down from the loft before first light, and made the coffee because she needed something to do with her hands, and because standing in the middle of a strange man's cabin waiting for him to wake up felt worse than being useful. She found the coffee tin where he'd left it, found the pot, worked the stove damper until the coals caught. When he came out of the dark corner where the bed was, she had 2 cups on the table. He looked at them, then at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." He sat down and drank his coffee. She sat across from him and drank hers. The sun came up through the east window and laid itself across the table in a long yellow stripe between them. "I'm not going to tell you you're free," he said finally, "because I already know you know that. What I'll say is this." He set down his cup, looked at the table instead of her. "You do what work you're willing to do. I do the same. End of each month, I'll give you a share." She stared at him. "A share of what?" "Pelts, mostly. Sometimes timber. I take it to town twice a year, sell it." He picked up his cup again. "You stay the winter. You'll have enough to go somewhere. Start something, if that's what you want." Opal turned her coffee cup in her hands. It was warm, and her hands were cold, and she focused on that small particular fact while she worked out what to say. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to consider this as a genuine question, which she appreciated. "Because that's the arrangement that makes sense," he said. It wasn't the answer she'd expected, but it was, she thought, possibly an honest one. She stayed. Not because she decided to, exactly. More because the days kept coming, one after another, and each one had enough in it to fill her hands and her mind, and leaving required a plan, and the plan kept needing another day. She learned the rhythm of the place fast. Rook was up before dawn, out in the cold, doing whatever needed doing. Checking the trap lines, splitting wood, hauling water from the spring when it hadn't frozen over. She kept the cabin, managed the stores, found the root cellar behind the cabin that he'd apparently forgotten to mention, which held more than she'd expected. Potatoes, dried, apples, hard cheese packed in cloth, 3 crocks of lard. "You've got more than you think," she told him that evening. He looked up from the harness he was mending. "Found the root cellar?" "You didn't tell me about it." "Didn't think about it," he said. Which, from him she'd already learned, was not an excuse but simply the truth. She started cooking in earnest after that. Real food, not just the survival kind. She made potato soup that steamed up the windows and cornmeal mush with dried apples stirred through it. And once, when she found a small crock of molasses pushed to the back of a shelf, something that approximated a gingerbread, dense and dark, and not quite right, but close enough that she sat with her piece and felt, for the first time in months, something that was not entirely unhappiness. Rook ate whatever she put in front of him without complaint and without excessive praise, which she respected more than she would have liked. They talked, in the evenings, slowly at first, like people who aren't sure the ice is thick enough to cross. He told her, one night, that he'd come up to the mountain after his brother died, that there'd been a falling out before that, one of those rifts that happens between men who are too alike and too proud, and then his brother died before they could close it, and after that the mountain seemed like the better option. She told him, another night, about her mother, about how she'd been the one who kept things together after, and how keeping things together meant less and less the longer her father drank. She didn't tell it as a tragedy. She told it plainly, the way you report weather. He listened the same way, One evening she asked him why he hadn't gotten married some earlier time before the mountain. He was quiet for so long, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Got close, he said. She went with somebody steadier. Steadier meaning what? Meaning somebody who stayed in one place. Opal looked at him across the fire. Jaw set in that particular way he had when something still had a small tooth in it. The mountain was there first, she said. Before her. Yeah. He picked up his whittling again. Something like that. The crisis came in the first week of December. She should have seen it coming. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days in a way that felt different from the usual cold. More serious, more intentional, as if the mountain itself had made a decision. The clouds were the wrong color. The birds had gone quiet in the way they go quiet, right before something large happened. Rook had gone out before light to pull in the far trap line before the storm hit. He took the dog, a grey-muzzled hound named nothing in particular, that she'd taken to calling Old Quiet, and he said he'd be back by midday. By midday the snow had started. By early afternoon she couldn't see the tree line. He wasn't back. She built the fire up and stood at the window and watched the white world beyond the glass, and felt something cold that wasn't the weather settle in her chest. She made herself eat something. She split the kindling he'd started on the day before, carrying the pieces inside, filling the box by the stove. She told herself he knew these woods like his own hands. He'd been up here for years before she arrived. He didn't need her to worry about him. She worried about him. He came in just before dark, half carrying himself through the door, and she saw the way he was holding his right leg and knew before he said anything. Caught a root under the snow, he said. Went down the wrong way on it. She got him to the chair, knelt down and pulled off his boot, while he held himself very still and breathed through his nose the way men do when they're trying not to show something. It wasn't broken. She probed it with careful fingers, watching his face for the particular flinch that meant bone, and it wasn't there. Badly sprained, possibly worse. Either way, he wasn't going to be walking on it for a while. How long till the storm breaks? She asked. Could be 3 days, could be a week. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. Then we'd better figure out what needs doing, she said. She did most of it herself. The trap lines she let go. She wasn't ready to navigate them alone in a storm, and he couldn't go with her. But she hauled the water, split the wood, kept the fire, fed the dog, managed the stores with a care that she calculated as she went, rationing the heavy things, stretching the lighter ones. Rook tried to help. He was not a man who sat still easily. She found him, on the second day, up on his bad leg trying to reach a high shelf, and she pointed at his chair without speaking, and he looked at her face and sat back down. You can't do all of this, he said. I'm doing it. Opal, unless, she said, turning back to the stove. You'd like to explain to me what part of it I should stop doing. He didn't say anything after that, but when she looked up an hour later, he was shelling the dried beans from the sack she'd left within reach, sorting them into the pot without being asked, doing what he could from where he was. She looked at his bent head, the seriousness with which he attended to the small task. She felt something shift in her chest, soft and unasked for, and she turned back to the stove before it could settle anywhere. The nights were the hardest part, and not for any reason she'd expected. The cabin was small. The fire burned low. The wind came down off the peaks and pressed itself against every seam in the log work, and in the dark, the sound of it was close to a voice without being one. She lay up in the loft and listened to him move in the dark below. The small sounds of a person trying not to disturb another person. And she was aware, with a sharpness that surprised her, of how much space one person can take up, even when they're being quiet. On the 4th night she couldn't sleep, and neither, apparently, could he. I used to hate winter, she said into the dark. A pause. What changed? He asked. She thought about it. Nothing yet, she said. I'll tell you if something does. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She'd noticed that about him. He found things funny sometimes, but the laugh that came out was abbreviated, like a word he'd started and reconsidered. She found herself listening for it more than she would have admitted. The storm broke on the 6th day. The world outside was remade. The pine boughs held snow like something precious, and the sky behind them was the color of a blue plate, hard and clean and achingly clear. She went out into it and breathed the cold deep, and felt it move through her like a bell ringing, that particular feeling of a thing resolving after a long pressure. She cleared the path from the cabin door to the woodshed, dug out the root cellar door, found old Quiet's water bowl frozen solid and brought it inside to thaw. Rook came to the door and watched her. "Legs better," he said. "Enough to walk? Enough to stand in a doorway." She drove the shovel into the snowpack and looked at him. He looked back at her. The morning light was low and gold, and it caught the grey in his beard and the lines around his eyes, all those years of squinting into mountain weather. "Go sit down," she said. "You can walk in 2 more days." He almost smiled. He went and sat down. She found the papers in March. She wasn't looking for anything. She was reorganizing the shelf above the stove, cans and tins that had gotten shuffled over the winter. And behind a row of beeswax candles, she found a folded document, brown at the edges, and she opened it before she'd thought about whether she should. It was a deed. The cabin, the surrounding land, the ridge, in Rook's name, and at the bottom, in handwriting that wasn't his, someone had added a second line, and to any lawful spouse or partner, should such be named. She folded it back the way she'd found it, and put it behind the candles and didn't say anything about it. But she thought about it. She thought about it more than she should have. In April, when the last of the snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes, and the first green things were pressing up through the mud, she found what she'd been putting off finding. The 37 cents and the knife were still in her boot. She'd moved them over the winter, boot to coat pocket to the small tin she kept at the back of the loft, but she'd never spent them, and she'd never left them behind. They were the things she carried, the thing that meant she could go if she needed to. She took them out and looked at them in the afternoon light coming through the east window. 37 cents, enough for a meal maybe, in whatever town she picked, enough to telegraph somebody if there was anybody to telegraph, enough to matter more than nothing, less than much. She thought about the winter, about the fire she'd built, and the wood she'd split, and the beans she'd sorted in the dark, and the sound of his breathing when the cabin was very quiet. She thought about the deed behind the candles. She thought about the woman who'd gone, with somebody steadier. She went outside, and found him at the wood pile, back at work, now that the leg had healed, building up the supply for next winter, with the methodical patience that she'd come to understand as his primary language. He didn't stop working when she came out. He just waited. She held out her hand. The coins caught the light. He stopped splitting, looked at what she was holding. "This was in my boot," she said. "Say, the day you brought me here. I kept it all winter." She set the coins on the top log of the woodpile between them. "I want you to know that I could have left, probably more than once. I stayed because I chose to." He looked at the coins for a long moment. When he looked up at her, his face had that quality it sometimes got, opened and a little raw, and trying hard to be neutral. "I know," he said. "I don't think you do," she said, "which is why I'm telling you." He was quiet. The woodpecker that had been working at the old birch down the slope went on with its business. The creek below the cabin muttered to itself over the rocks. "What do you want, Opal?" he asked. She had thought about how she would answer this, in the way that she thought about things. Turned it over while her hands were doing something else, held it up to different light. "I want to know," she said, "if when the next winter comes, you want me here." He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze. She'd gotten good at holding her ground with him. It had taken until February, but she'd gotten there. "Yes," he said. His voice was low and not complicated. "I want you here." "Then say it again." Not because I need to hear it twice, because I want you to know you said it, that it was a real thing you said. Something moved through his face, something quiet, and she thought, long overdue, I want you here, Opal. Next winter and the one after that. She nodded. She picked up the 37 cents and put them back in her pocket. She would keep them, not because she needed to go anymore, but because a woman ought to have something that is purely hers, a small heavy proof that she is a person and not just a presence. Good, she said. Now move over. You're holding the maul wrong. He blinked. I've been splitting wood since before you were. Wrong, she said, and held out her hand for the maul. He looked at her. A real smile this time, not the abbreviated kind, something that started slow and then committed to itself. He handed over the maul. She hefted it, found the balance point, looked at the round of pine set up on the block, brought it down clean. The wood fell in two perfect halves, and the sound of it rang out, sharp and clear across the slope, and, somewhere down in the birches, Old Quiet lifted his grey head and decided it wasn't worth getting up over, and settled back down into the April mud. Above the ridge, the sky was enormous and blue, and the kind of cold that doesn't hurt anymore. Winter was finished with them for now, and Opal Finch, who had been bought for $22 and a sack of dried corn, stood in the mountain light with a maul in her hands and 37 cents in her pocket, and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, entirely her own.